Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Infinite Learning's webinar. My name is Rebecca Anand. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Infinite Learning. So we're delighted to be running our webinar today with Jeanie Davies, and we're going to welcome her to speak about the trust revolution in schools, how to create humane, high-performance and collaborative cultures. Now, Jeanie's intro to this webinar is that teachers are some of the kindest, most altruistic and smartest people on the planet. Yet, despite the best of intentions, fearful atmospheres can arise organically within schools, leaving people feeling disempowered, anxious, isolated and frustrated. Why is this? What are the impacts? And crucially, how do we resolve it? It's interesting actually, because just before we started the webinar, Jeanie and I were just talking about the impact of COVID on teaching and ourselves, and actually this probably could not be more timely in terms of the challenges that we face in education right now. So I'm really pleased that Jeanie's here to talk to us, because I'm sure much of what she will say will spill over and be pertinent to our current situation. Now, before I hand over to Jeanie, just a few small areas of housekeeping. So attendees are automatically on listen only mode. Obviously, there's quite a number of you, but what we're going to do is allow you to ask questions through the chat as we go along. So we'll allow Jeanie to deliver her presentation in full, but as that goes on, and if things arise that you have a question about, please do enter that into the chat area, and then at the end of the session we'll do a live Q&A with Jeanie and answer as many of those questions as possible. Also, just to let you know that at 5 o'clock tomorrow, so 24 hours after the end of the session, you'll receive a link to a video of this session. So if you weren't able to stay for all of it, or you have a colleague that missed it and you wanted to share that with them, that will be available tomorrow. And we'll also send you a certificate of attendance with that email. And immediately after this session, you'll receive an email with details of Jeanie's virtual course, which is obviously related to this webinar, and also a little resource that Jeanie has kindly shared with us. So I think that's it from me for now. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jeanie. Over you go.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thanks for joining me today. I do look a little like I'm just about to play at Fortnite, as I was saying to Rebecca, but that won't come into today's session. So yes, the trust revolution in schools. So indeed, this really is a session that looks at the work that sits behind the book that I have published with Routledge in July. And it comes really from my work. I trained as a teacher about nearly 20 years ago now, and my parents were both teachers, moved into teaching because I knew that teachers are really lovely people and I wanted to work with really lovely people. And as I worked in schools, I loved the teaching, I loved the people individually. But what I started to find was that actually the politics, as it was called then, could be tricky. I often felt reasonably toxic at times in some of the schools I worked in, not all at all. Teams, or indeed the way people behave with one another at times, just didn't feel like it reflected the nature of what teachers are actually like. I didn't really have the language at that point, and then I went off and I had my twins, and when I returned, I worked for a large charity called Teach First that in the UK train teachers in particularly deprived areas, and that's where I really learned the leadership and coaching of teachers. And over the last 6 years, I've worked for myself. And this is where I started to hear the inner lives of teachers and hear about the fact that actually a lot of teachers talked again about this sense that I had that actually it was how they felt often in schools and the interactions they were having with colleagues that were arising, and the way that they didn't feel it mirrored the way that actually the compassion that was shown to the children that all teachers showed to the children was not being mirrored in the compassion with one another. And from that coaching, I was finding also that often the coaching actions that were happening were hitting this wall of a culture which was not enabling collaboration, not enabling people to access one another. And so they weren't going anywhere. So this led me with my master's and my research work with Warwick University to look at kind of how we change cultures. And I started to do this work in schools and replicate it. And from the work in the master's, you look back and you realise, oh gosh, this is what we did. This is the model. This is how it worked. And about 18 months ago, I had the opportunity to co-head a school and actually put my money where my mouth is, and not just stand alongside and do the CPD, but actually do this in a school where we moved it from one where 50% of the staff had actually left in the previous year to 100% of the staff staying. So what I'd like to do today is to share some of the learnings I have with you, and perhaps you know, to think about you know, how this might resonate for you, or some of the experience currently or indeed previously that you may have felt within the education setting. So I want to just come back to that same quote that really Rebecca started with the intro. Teachers are some of the kindest, most altruistic and smartest people on the planet, yet they can create some of the most claustrophobic and toxic cultures within which to work, not with the children, but with one another. Why is this? How is this? And what are the impacts? And really importantly, how do we resolve this? And please do feel free to put things in the chat of how this resonates, how that feels, but how does that feel for you? Does that mirror any of the experiences that you have had within education? So the objectives of this session, or the things that I would really like to look at, are very simple. I just want to explore fear in schools. And I want to start using some of these terms, these emotion-based terms, because I'd like to touch upon how we're evolved within emotion, yet often within a professional setting, we push that away. Yet we need to look at that to really understand what's happening. And how we can create trust. How can we actually do that? We talk about trust, yes, it's elusive, but how do we actually do that within these settings? So fear versus trust, let's start with this, the need for evolution. Where does this come from? Well, again, these are UK-based statistics, but my understanding is a lot of this is mirrored within schools internationally, and it would be really interesting to get a sense from you of how you feel. But essentially, there's been an increase in the last 6 years in the UK of teachers leaving the profession of 31%. And in 2017, for the first time since records began, the number of teachers leaving the profession was higher than those entering. And 20% of NQTs leave the UK state sector within 2 years. And there is a constant narrative now within education around well-being and stress, which often culminates in this idea of workload, which I think can be a red herring at times. So we can look at this within the context of what's happening. And it seems that it is that people are feeling more fearful in schools. And workload, government pressures and ideology are often cited as the reasons for teachers' underperformance and leaving the profession. But these are ubiquitous pressures across the school system, yet some schools thrive and retain staff while others do not, which leads us to think that is it actually these things, or is it something else that's going on? So from the research, we found that really these tend to be the 4 main reasons that are given for teachers leaving the profession, or indeed having high levels of workload, stress, anxiety, lack of well-being, are government, funding, accountability structures, and society. So government being the ideology of the government, what they are pushing out, and what they are inviting schools to do. This idea of accountability, the structures in the UK being Ofsted, but any of those accountability structures, large ones, and what that looks like and how that translates within a school. Funding, whether that be in terms of state funding, or indeed we found within the independent sector, looking at kind of that sense of keeping the children, or what that meant to keep children within the school. And indeed a society and the pressures, this idea that school has become a panacea for society and the pressures that come about with that, whether that be from deprivation to social media to any issues around safeguarding, that it is school that soaks that up. And really this has become like the mantra of a cage within education, that these are the things that are making teachers feel fearful. But I sort of suppose I come back again to this point that actually schools work within this framework, yet not all. are places where teachers are leaving or feeling stressed. And essentially the outcomes of the cage, this narrative of the cage, which is real, it's not a thing, it's absolutely there, these pressures, tends to be within schools this workload generated by frenetic need to do and change in a reaction to the idea that if the pressure and stress comes from out there, then the solution must be found externally too. And what we find is people are often behaving in schools like we are on red alert, that we're in absolute fear that we're being chased, by a bear or by an attacker, that we're sort of in danger. This underlying sense, so we're sort of frantically looking around the next alleyway to duck through, the next implement to use as a weapon, the next person to bolster our gang. And that's what's happening in schools. It's like we're looking for the next course, the next piece of software, the next concept to solve the issues. It's always something new to bring in. Yet in actual fact, this is a fear-based response to what's happening, and is triggering us to behave like this and to create more and more stuff to do. So indeed, the idea that the answer is out there is a fallacy, really, because it isn't. Because if it was, then somebody would have written the book and then we'd all be reading it and using it. There is my book, of course, but haha, I don't think that's the answer in itself at all. The answers really are in your school, but it's just being able to access them by looking internally and connecting dots and enabling people to join one another rather than feeling that it's out there. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that how we react to this cage is generating fear-based cultures in schools, and it's triggering us individually and as a tribe on quite a deep level. And this is what lies at the root of the predicament we're currently facing in the education system. That it's about looking within and thinking about actually not reacting in fear, but trying to react in trust. So how do we do this? How do we lean into trust? Well, before we do this, I'd like to just outline a little bit about how we are evolved for this fear and this idea of the tribe. So, of course, we are evolved to be in tribes. If you weren't in a tribe for millennia, you could not raise the children, get the water, get the food, be safe, all of those things that would keep you alive. Actually, being outside of the tribe was dangerous because you may die because of it. And so we're evolved with these 8 primary emotions: joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, anticipation. They keep us alive. They stop us eating the wrong things. They enable us to connect and attach to people, to stay within the tribe. They trigger fear when we are attacked or perceive that, to keep us alive on a deep evolutionary level. Now, we're not being attacked by bears anymore on a regular basis. We don't have to live within a tribe anymore to get the water, all those sorts of things. Yet this is a hugely recent, literally was in the last couple of centuries, if that we've lived like that. So all of this evolutionary response within us is still being triggered in exactly the same ways. And so as social creatures, the attachment emotions in particular are pivotal to our well-being. And I'd just like to read you this. These basic emotions do not have boundaries according to context. They are triggered in personal, professional context, something which is overlooked in many organisational settings. To speak of love and fear in many professional settings would seem ludicrous, yet it is the foundation of all human interaction. Without understanding and harnessing the emotional interplay within an organisation, it is easy to see why many workplaces are unsuccessful or create particularly stressful cultures. So this idea of being professional, again, is a fallacy. Of course, there are professional behaviours, but it's what are those? They look very different in different settings. To be professional as a clown is different to be professional as a teacher, as an accountant, as a fighter. So what does that look like to be professional? And they are very much attached to how we feel. I'm sure you're very well aware of this, all as educators, of the fight, flight, or freeze three F's to fear, essentially, that we tend to reach for one more easily than the others. This idea of standing up to fight, to get rid of the attacker, to flying, to run as fast as we can, or freezing, going quiet. So we hope we will no longer be noticed within any situation as a response to keep us alive. But these are still being triggered every day. So we see flight responses in school might be calling in sick, not attending a meeting, you know, freeze, doing a task even if we don't agree with it or understand it. Fight might be calling someone out in briefing, or indeed getting union involvement in, you know, bolstering the gang, you know. These are responses that we see, fear-based responses that are coming up. So I guess what I'm talking about here really is this idea of social capital, which you may well have come across, and it has been very documented really. But if we are, what we do is we start to feel fearful if we start to feel we're outside of a tribe. So if we don't feel that we are within that tribe, our fear responses come up. And indeed, it is social capital that is the thing that generates the collaboration that allows excellence and high performance within schools. And it's been found over and over again that you can take a group of really high performing teachers and they have high human capital, i.e. they have excellent skills in teaching and learning, they may have expertise in lots of different phonics or maths, or indeed those things that we're interviewed for, I say. But actually, if they have very little social capital, i.e. the ability to access one another, know how to behave with one another, be able to make each other feel okay within part of the tribe, they will not perform. They'll compete, in actual fact. And it becomes very difficult for them to be able to upskill one another and be with one another. Yet you can take actually a group of very average teachers with sort of average, you know, or even poor human capital, those individual skills. But if you can provide excellent social capital within them, that they can access one another, speak to one another, share, be at ease with one another, that's where the success comes. And there's a fabulous book by Hargreaves and Fulham called Professional Capital. And this is where this quote comes from. If you concentrate your efforts on increasing individual talent, you'll have a devil of a job producing greater social capital. There's just no mechanism or motivation to bring all that talent together. But the reverse is not true. High social capital does generate human capital, and individuals get confidence, learning and feedback, having the right kind of interventions and relationships around them, which drives performance through ease. So I invite you really to think about it in some ways. You know, teachers don't tend to go home grinding their teeth about the children. It tends to be the other adults in the building that comes about with, yeah. And in school, CPD is usually exclusively about generating individual human capital, so skills for the individual, as opposed to how we behave around here, how we can be with one another, how we feel these things. And we can audit trust and fear cultures. And I invite you really now to have a think of where you are or your school is on perhaps a scale of 1 to 10. 10 being, I feel I can trust 100% between myself and colleagues and leaders in my school. I feel at ease and that I can trust. Or indeed, 1 being, I feel quite fearful in my school, thinking about kind of this learning, okay, that actually, you know, I am triggering fear responses. And indeed, the audit is one of the things that hopefully if you decide you'd like to join me for my course, that we look at of how you do it. So I can give you the audit of how you can look at the cultures within your teams and schools and get a sense of where you are on that 1 to 10. So I'd like to move on now to the model. So we've talked a lot here about fear, and I'd like to talk a little bit about trust now, or we're going to start to talk more about trust now. How do we create more trust within our schools? And this is the model that I sort of offer up to you to generate that trust. So the top layer of this is the outcomes. So the collaboration, the upskilling of one another, the improved teaching and learning and well-being. If those are the outcomes that you want in your school, let's go down to the next level. Okay, so what's the culture we need? We need a trust-based culture. Yeah, so how do we create that? Well, there are 4 preconditions. The first being the ability to speak openly, okay? The second being the ability to be adult, yeah? The ability to be adult. and we're going to explore each of these. Yeah. The third being the ability to see failure as an opportunity to learn. And the fourth, the ability to give and receive robust and curious feedback, yeah, that holds that person in high regard. And what sits underneath these preconditions are catalysts and four models, psychological models. They come from management development, neuroscience, and psychology. So the first being something called the ZOOD, zones of uncomfortable discussion. The second being transactional analysis, which looks at this idea of unconscious behaviours. The third being growth mindset, which I imagine you are familiar with, Carol Dweck's work, but we often immediately take that to the children. But this is about taking a step back and looking at this in terms of the adults, the grown-ups, what are their mindsets like? And the final one being the feedback model, which is a model that I have assimilated from a lot of different works to look at how we do that with a model for feedback that creates curiosity and compassion, holding that person firmly at it, that if we are honest with somebody and we really hold them with high regard, then we can develop them in a compassionate way as opposed to a judgmental way. So if we take this as the model, the trust revolution model, let's look at some of these preconditions. I'd like to briefly touch upon these. But before that, I suppose let's have a quick look at what the benefits are to trust-based cultures. And these are some of the quotes that I've taken from some of the work that I've done. So I used to go home grinding my teeth about other staff members. Now I feel better able to feed back and talk through these issues. I no longer have a queue of people at my door wanting me to solve all their issues. There's less talking behind people's back. Instead, people feel more able to bring up issues and challenges without feeling humiliated or fearful of repercussions. My classroom practice has come on leaps and bounds because of increased feedback from the TAs I work with and greater collaboration within the department. I'm really trying to work on my mindset so I'm less defensive when discussing areas I can improve. I realise I spend a lot of time expecting management to sort out issues for me. I'm more proactive now and feel more able to take risks. So these are some of, as I say, the people that I've worked with, some of the feedback that I've had or that have changed in the system. When people start to really think and embed these preconditions or indeed have conversations around them. So the first precondition is the ability to speak openly. Discuss the elephant in the room, if you like. And this is an interesting one because it pertains particularly to the teaching community, I think, or indeed to any industry which attracts nurturers. Because nurturers often, by definition, like harmony. And the preference for harmony means that they, or we, I should say, as I am very much one of this community, we often do not like conflict, find conflict difficult. So instead, we'll avoid it. And that leads to suppression, which can often lead to kind of leaking, which can lead to this idea of sort of more passive aggression, or indeed the bitching behind backs is kind of a leaking of this, because there's an inability to actually speak openly and say what we need to say to one another without a sense that we will wound one another. Yeah, there's this constant pervasive sense that we need to kind of look after each other's emotions. But by doing that, the paradox is, in actual fact, we create paranoia and a misunderstanding and other narratives going on. There are other blocks really to the ability to speak openly in schools. Can be ego, particularly of those within senior leadership or leadership of departments or phases, that they only want yes men about them. You know, I can't imagine there's much open speaking that going on at times around Trump. You know, if the ego is big, often people want agreement all of the time to make themselves feel better. Hierarchy, this inability to kind of go up and down the hierarchical chain because it's not my place to say something. Or indeed a baggage, emotional baggage. If within your family it was not the done thing to speak openly, best said, soon is mended. We don't have the skills or tools to do it. Or indeed, if we've spoken openly in professional settings previously and been shot down or humiliated, that creates real issues. And if we cannot speak openly to one another, then what happens is that we create our own stories in our heads and our own narratives. So this is sort of the ladder of inference. So if you see there's available information at the bottom, we look at that available information, we observe, we interpret, we conclude, and we act. And our actions come from the original available information and the narrative we've created through that time. And when I go into schools and coach members of say the same team, or in some smaller schools I coach sort of everybody in that school, I may well hear the same situation from everybody's different viewpoint, and I very rarely meet a psychopath. They all come with the best of intentions, yet because they've misunderstood each other, we've created kind of narratives within our heads about one another, which makes that very difficult to come back from. An example of this that I saw in a school recently was, before we were in the COVID situation, was that there's an after-school club, and the deputy head normally was around after school to pick up any issues that came from that, or indeed when parents didn't turn up on time. But the deputy head was leaving at 4:30, and what had happened was that the year 5 teachers in that school were then because their rooms were right next to the after school club, they were being left to kind of deal with all these issues of any behavioural issues, or indeed parents coming late. So they started to get really cross about this, but didn't want to say anything because previously they'd spoken up to management as they'd seen it, and had been shot down and felt that was very difficult. So they started this kind of really kind of talking a lot behind the deputy's back, oh, this is just typical of him, we're left with this sort of moaning. What they didn't realise was the deputy was leaving early because his wife was suffering with depression quite chronically, and he didn't want to share that with anybody. He'd spoken with the head teacher who had allowed that, and he was going home dealing with quite difficult situation, and then often working a lot later on. But what happened was he didn't understand that there were issues with the fact that he was leaving, because nobody told him that because he was leaving early, these issues were arising. So he started to perceive the year 5 staff as becoming very negative and difficult, and why were they? So what happened was that because neither could access each other's narratives, they became very discompassionate. They wouldn't hold each other in compassion, and that became really problematic until that could be openly voiced. So these are the things that kind of arise when we can't speak openly to one another. The second precondition is the ability to be adult, and this is the transactional analysis, the catalyst. I'm not going to talk too much about the catalyst in today's session, but it pertains to that. This idea that we unconsciously move out of different ego states: the parent ego state, the adult ego state, and the child ego state. None of them are right or wrong. We just go in and out of them, and often we have ones that we sort of tap into more easily, I suppose. They're more congruent with our personality types. The parent ego state very much is that is controlling. It is the one that's in control, it's responsible, it's nurturing, it is parental. And we get it from previous experiences of when we've seen parent figures, or indeed we've seen authority figures. The child ego state, which I suppose is the complementary ego state, is when we feel what's replayed from childhood, when we felt kind of victim to something, that we're not in control, that we're not responsible at all, or indeed we're very playful about something, that we don't need to kind of step up and have any responsibility. And then there's the adult ego state, which doesn't pull from any previous kind of emotional wiring. It's very much dealing in the here and now with what's going on, very much rational of the here and now. And ideally, that's where we are within our professional lives. That's not to say we don't move in and out of these other ones, or that they're wrong, but we often don't have a sense of it. And so So if I can give you some examples, because sometimes this brings this to life. So for example, a teacher, I don't know, an NQT might be going, or in the early stages of their career, but indeed it happens a lot sort of in the later ones, might go to another head of department. I can't get these children to behave. I just can't do it. It's awful. I'll never be a teacher that can allow this to happen. They're very much within that child ego state of, okay, I want you to solve this for me, help me. And often we find that leaders, because particularly they feel that they have to solve people's problems, leaders will go into parents and say, don't worry, I've seen this before, I've got lots of advice to give you. Have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried this? And then that teacher might go away and try out that behaviour strategy, try out that. But if it doesn't work, they're straight back to the leader. Okay, well, that didn't work, give me another one. Because they are looking for somebody to solve their problems. Indeed, the leader is stepping up to do that. That parent-child interaction is not empowering or useful at all within a professional setting, and it can be good for the ego, because as a parent you can feel, the parent sort of feels like, oh, I'm giving, I'm doing here, but indeed it keeps people disempowered, I suppose, essentially, and not as authentic within their learning, and indeed allows that person to see the leader or the person that is being parental as the one to kind of blame when it goes wrong, or to be in charge. We don't want to generate more children within our schools. We've got plenty of them already. And indeed, this is one of the reasons why we have such strong parent-child interactions within our schools, because we deal with children as, in a parental sense a lot of the time. Or indeed, we all know what it's like to have been a child within a school. So if you're getting sort of disconnection between management and teachers, or this sort of blame for the culture elsewhere, you're probably in the sort of parent-child state. Whereas what we need is people stepping into adult, and how we can question and move back into that kind of more rational state where we're both okay with one another, where we're coaching alongside. So what would you do if somebody's coming to you? I can't do this. Well, tell me what you've done. Okay, what have you tried already? Okay, what have you seen that's worked elsewhere? How do you feel? Unpicking it, having those conversations to be adults, asking more questions, to be able to be alongside one another and seeing each other as empowered people that can, and whole, as opposed to broken and needing to be fixed. So that's the second precondition. The third is the ability to see failure as an opportunity to learn. Indeed, the ability to kind of take risks and to move outside your comfort zone in terms of your learning. We know that that's important for learning. We can't learn without stepping outside our comfort zone and failing. Failure is the way of feeding back. But if we see failure as something that decimates us, it defines us, that actually, oh, I have failed at that, and therefore I will never get better because I'm just not good at maths, art, teaching, phonics, I don't know, with my year 8 pupils. If we see it as a full stop, then that means that any failure is a very dangerous thing, and we will start to try and protect ourselves from it. We will not put ourselves in a situation where we would fail because we see it as humiliating and damaging. We often see this, or I've seen this very much within well, I think the current climate within schools is quite anti-failure for teachers at the moment, and I think that's a legacy of accountability structures that have led to that. I think that is starting to change in some places. But I think it's also, we see it particularly with people who are used to, say, succeeding. When I worked for Teach First, we had a lot of real kind of high flyers coming in to train as teachers, and perhaps the first time they were failing was when they stood up in front of the year 10 class who would just not play ball. Then there was an implosion, and actually that's when we often start to see all of the defensiveness coming up. Well, it must be because of this, putting it elsewhere. It's all of the kind of excuses, all of the things that are coming about, and that's not to say that there aren't reasons for things happening, but if you externalize failure as it being somebody else's problem, as opposed to looking within and thinking, okay, what is it that I can do differently? What can I learn here? What can I see differently? Well, that's a different mindset completely, and it allows you actually to really soak up all the information that you need. But again, that has to be given in a way where you're standing alongside as adults with other people. You're not being judged and told that that's wrong and that you have to do it in a right way, that you have the opportunity to explore that and think, okay, what can I learn from here and how do I change it? So that precondition fundamentally underpins all the others, and particularly this one, the precondition for the ability to give and receive robust and curious feedback. And feedback has become very siloed in schools around this idea of that we are just feedback is just done in the classroom, and I come in, I look at your lesson, and I tell you what's right and I tell you what's wrong, and then you have to stop doing what's wrong and start doing what's right. Yeah. Well, that's not feedback, that's judgment. Feedback should be everywhere in every aspect of the school, and it's telling people what you notice. What do you notice about them? I notice when you do this, this happens. You know, and we often say feedback resonates as a negative word. Often people think of critical feedback. They don't hear as much the positive feedback. And positive feedback isn't just thank you, that was great. Positive feedback is as much unpicking what was good about something as when you might unpick what didn't work so much. Feedback is about blind spots. You know, if I've got something on my back or something in my teeth, until you tell me, I don't know that and I can do nothing around it. And it's fundamental to catalyze change. We cannot change without feedback. Change is hugely complex. That's why there's millions of books written about it. And we all find it very difficult to change our eating habits, our exercise habits, our fundamental ways of being. But you cannot do any of that without some feedback. And indeed, it also tunes into this idea of deliberate practice, which is crucial to how we learn. That it's not just that the hours of practice; it's the hours of practice with feedback within it. And indeed, if you're in a culture where people cannot give each other feedback for all sorts of reasons, you know, that they're too, again, coming back to there's ego, there's hierarchy, they're worried about hurting each other through feedback, or indeed feedback is about judgment rather than discussion and exploration. And you get pent-up feedback where people walking around knowing things about each other and they're frustrated they can't let that out. And again, that can lead to the leaking, the bitching behind people's backs, or indeed the sense that actually that person should just know how to do this better but I can't tell them. I'm not going to tell them because it should be so obvious. So until we can start to give and receive robust and curious feedback, we cannot actually trust one another fundamentally, because we're not sure about what we know about one another. Just because you're given feedback doesn't mean that it's necessarily valid, but it is about noticing. What do we see and notice about one another? So I'm coming towards the end really here of what I wanted to share with you today, and these are sort of the bones really of this work. Yeah, and I'll come back to the model again. You know, that if you truly want these outcomes at the top, the way to do this is to discover that people have to feel better with one another. We need to start looking at what I term SPD as much as CPD, staff personal development. How do we personally develop our cognitive behaviours, our ability to kind of look at what we're doing and how we're behaving, to enable that to create a rich subsoil and structure from which we can overlay all those other great CPD things. But if we don't actually feel right with one another, then we're in those fear structures and we're working within that way rather than an expansive and open trust culture. And I suppose, yeah, just to bring back really to this is the work, you know, and to create high performance collaborative cultures. And indeed, it wasn't really towards the end of the book when the title had been nailed down and it couldn't be changed anymore by Routledge, but I really want that word humane to be in there. And I think just to come to what, you know, Rebecca said at the beginning, you know, we are in extraordinary times at the moment where trust is really elusive within all structures, because we can't really trust what we know at the moment for many reasons. And we're in very uncertain times. How do we actually shore ourselves up within our schools and within our societies? And it's about being able to more openly access one another rather than closing down the ability to speak and talk. But what are the rules around that? And we would have had rules, you know, as a tribe sitting around the campfire, we had rules of interactions of how we could actually access one another. And we can do this within our schools. I've seen it redone. I've stood alongside it, and I've had the pleasure of being able to do that myself as well. I would love to have any questions, any thoughts, any comments from you now within the chat, to get a sense of your thinking around this and your experiences.
Thank you so much, Jeanie. I'm just going to see if any more questions come in. We've not really got a comment at the moment from Trudy. Thanks, Trudy, saying thanks so much, Jeanie. There is some excellent work in here. I'm looking forward to checking out your book. So that's great. Any questions, guys? Please do send those through. There was an awful lot of content in there. What resonated really for me was working with the national professional qualifications and facilitating on the middle leader and senior leader programs. One of the key areas in there is actually all about building teams and trust and relationships. And actually, you know, when I start facilitating with participants, I actually say that I could sum up the entire program in 2 words. And those 2 words are trust and relationships. And so much of what you said there, you know, reinforce that to the point where actually I'd like to suggest that the IOE, if they don't know your work, take a look at it and include it in some of their additional resources and reading if you'd be interested in that, because it's so, particularly that model at the end there, it's so in tune with everything that the Institute of Education talk about. And by the way, they're number 1 in the world for educational research for the past 6 years. So your ideas tally with much of what they say, and you're in very good company. Any other questions, anyone? Okay, I'm just going to ramble on about a few other little bits and pieces. So please do, if you've got anything, feel free, or any feedback at all. We'd love to hear that and to share that with Jeanie, who's so kindly given of her time this afternoon. If you can't think of any questions right now but would like think of something later, please do send that through to me, and I'll share that with Jeanie, who will get back to you. Obviously the webinar recording will come out tomorrow, as I said, along with a certificate of attendance, and there's an email coming out straight after the webinar with a little resource that Jeanie has shared with you, a little takeaway. But obviously, if this was an area of interest to you and you'd like to understand more about the trust revolutions in schools and how you might even want to implement that in your schools, then do have a look online at our virtual course entitled the same, the Trust Revolution in Schools, and you know, get yourself enrolled for that. Our initial plan when Jeanie and I first met and discussed this idea online was that ultimately we'd like Jeanie to be out here and come and work with some of you on site in your schools, but we're obviously aware that right now that's probably not going to happen. So we're delighted to be running a virtual version of the course. So please do go have a look at that. I'm pretty sure we ran that at times that were sort of like twilight sessions and shorter blocks of sessions, so that it's accessible. We know that everyone's sort of over the screen time really, but you know, it's a case of trying to move forward with some professional development, and I think for me personally this is a particularly important piece of professional learning as an opportunity. So I'm just going to do one more check to see if we've got any more questions here. No more questions. So okay, Jeanie, I'm going to say a big thank you to you. Really interesting topic, and I'm hoping that we'll get lots of people signed up for your programme. And thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoyed it and found it worthwhile. Do go check out our website. There's some new webinars coming up soon, and lots of virtual courses we're adding to that every week. So please do check it out, and obviously get in touch with me as always if you've got any questions at all. Okay, goodbye everyone. Thanks very much. And
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeanie. Okay,
thanks.
Take care everybody, and enjoy your half term, everybody, when you get there. Incredibly well earned this term. I possibly think probably one of the hardest you've perhaps had in your teaching career, if my husband, who's a teacher's word is anything to go by. I know it's been incredibly challenging and tiring, so please do all take some time away from your screens and have a lovely half term. And Jeanie, thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.